Thank you, Dr. Allen. Yes, sir. Well, I don't know about the prettiest, but maybe the least amount of gray hair, at least. So that's what we'll go with. Well, good afternoon, everyone. It's a privilege to be here with you and a part of this. I'll never forget my very first expository preaching workshop that I attended. I was an MDiv student, had just shown up for classes. It was the fall of 2007, and I had not had a chance to take expository preaching yet. There's a few prerequisites you have to take before you can take preaching, some language courses. But I remember coming in the back and attending my first expository preaching workshop and hearing about text-driven preaching. I had read one book on preaching at this point, and it did not advocate for text-driven preaching, let me just say. So this was a totally new concept for me, but I had shown up to Southwestern knowing that this place had a reputation for training preachers. And I knew God had called me to preach. And how thankful I am that in God's providence has allowed me to come here, to be a part of this, to study here, and now today to be able to share with you some things that I've learned and to dive into Ruth chapter 4 specifically. So let's do just that. Let me see if my clicker is working well here. Yeah, absolutely. So first thing that I want to do is walk through just some basic steps in an introductory way about, we're hearing this terminology, text-driven preaching, but what about a definition of text-driven preaching? You're going to see this if you read Dr. Smith's book. This comes straight from him, so total credit to him, but this will allow us to get a handle on what we're going to do moving forward. Text-driven preaching is interpreting and communicating a biblical text in a sermon that represents that text, its substance, its structure, and its spirit in a sermon. So we're grasping for what it says, but not just what it says, but how it's packaged, how the author has delivered it, and then finally the tone or emotive feel of that text as he has communicated it. This next quote is also something that I think is helpful to keep in mind as we talk about text-driven preaching, because the essence of text-driven preaching, if I had to put it in my own words, is simply treating the text on its own terms, coming to it as it would have us treat it and handle it. But when we think about doing that, John Stott says here, the essential secret of text-driven preaching or expository preaching in general, is not mastering certain techniques, but it's actually being mastered by certain convictions. And so this theology being more important than methodology of knowing exactly what we believe about the nature of Scripture that's going to determine how we treat it in a sermon. So the idea here is that once the foundation of a theologically driven philosophy of preaching that we call text-driven preaching is laid, one then must come behind and work out a method of doing it. How exactly is this going to be implemented and executed to build a sermon? So what I want to do in our allotted hour today is actually walk you through the steps that I've been trained in here in text-driven preaching. 10 steps as I'm going to articulate them today. Dr. Allen, if you read his book, Text-Driven Preaching, has 12. You're going to find these very similar to his. But I think this is going to be helpful in the sense that this is going to be what I try to work through, hopefully what you'll try to work through to actually compose and construct a sermon on Ruth chapter 4, or any text-driven sermon for that matter. And so we'll walk through these steps, and you actually have them in the handout that you have. Typically, these steps might take 20 to 25 hours of work, and so we're going to hit a lot of shortcuts to distill down in 1 hour the essence of them together. So just to take a quick overview of them together, you notice in that definition I gave you that the first part was interpreting and communicating, but interpreting the text is the first 4 steps that I want you to see here. Number 1, which might take you by surprise, determine the semantic structure of the passage. Now, don't let that kind of word scare you, that perhaps a word we don't use very often, but what that simply means is every text, think about it, is a forest composed of trees. And what we got to do, if we're going to communicate what it says, but not just what it says, but how it says it and what tone or emotive feel is there, in order to get to what it says, we need to see how the author's saying it. So the first thing that we want to do really is determine how this text is packaged. So we want to dive in and start identifying the trees, how they're spatially related to one another, how they're connected or not, in order to see how this text is packaged. So that's what we mean by determine the semantic structure of the passage. And then we're going to identify the exegetical idea of the passage after that. Then number 3, translate the meaning of the text. What I mean by that is we're going to take that exegetical information that we've gleaned and we're going to start translating that into the words we want to use that our people that we pastor, that you pastor, can understand. Translate that meaning from perhaps biblical jargon or theological jargon. We're going to put it in everyday terms. And then 4, we're going to construct a communication or a sermon outline that then represents that structure to our people in a sermon, that mirrors, if you will, the text of the structure in the sermon. So that's the interpreting part of the text. But then we move to communicating the text, and this is our last set of steps here, to 10 steps. Developing the logic of the transitions, how we're going to move from one part of the sermon to the next. Expressing the flow of the explanation. This is your one chance to get the text right, to explain what it says. Then we're going to take what we've explained and insert illustrations. Then we're going to articulate application, specific application for how to flesh this out. Add the argumentation, and then craft the conclusion and the introduction. So I want you to see, this is what I want to walk out working with Ruth for. We're going to walk out how to do these 10 steps. We're going to focus some on certain ones more than others as we go through this, and I hope this is helpful practically for you when it actually goes to constructing a sermon. So let's dive into part 1, interpreting the text, and step 1 here. In fact, I know this might take some time, but it's worth doing. I actually want to read the text. This is Ruth 4, so you've got it out. Jeff Frey said, good expository preaching begins with good reading. Your people understand the word and how you read it. How you actually convey what you're reading to them begins the process of helping them understand. So if you would follow along, let's read Ruth chapter 4. Now Boaz had gone up to the gate and sat down there. And behold, the Redeemer of whom Boaz had spoken came by. So Boaz said, turn aside, friend, and sit down here. And he turned aside and sat down. And he took 10 men of the elders of the city and said, sit down here. And so they sat down. Then he said to the Redeemer, Naomi, who has come back from the country of Moab, is selling the parcel of land that belonged to our relative Elimelech. So I thought I'd tell you of it and say, buy it in the presence of those sitting here and in the presence of the elders of my people. If you will redeem it, redeem it. But if you will not, tell me that I may know, for there's no one besides you to redeem it. And I come after you. And he said, I will redeem it. And then Boaz said, the day you buy the field from the hand of Naomi, you also acquire Ruth, the Moabite, the widow of the dead, in order to perpetuate the name of the dead in his inheritance. Then the Redeemer said, I cannot redeem it for myself, lest I impair my own inheritance. Take my right of redemption yourself, for I cannot redeem it. Now, this was the custom in former times in Israel concerning redeeming and exchanging. To confirm a transaction, the one drew off his sandal and gave it to the other, and this was the manner of attesting in Israel. So when the Redeemer said to Boaz, buy it yourself for yourself, he drew off his sandal. And then Boaz said to the elders and all the people, you are witnesses this day that I have bought from the hand of Naomi all that belonged to Elimelech and all that belonged to Chilion and Mahlon. Also Ruth the Moabite, the widow of Mahlon, I have bought to be my wife, to perpetuate the name of the dead in his inheritance, that the name of the dead may not be cut off from among his brothers and from the gate of his native place. You are witnesses this day. Then all the people who were at the gate and the elders said, we are witnesses. May the Lord make the woman who was coming into your house like Rachel and Leah, who together built up the house of Israel. May you act worthily in Ephrathah and be renowned in Bethlehem. And may your house be like the house of Perez, whom Tamar bore to Judah, because of the offspring that the Lord will give you by this young woman. So Boaz took Ruth, and she became his wife. And he went into her, and the Lord gave her conception, and she bore a son. And then the women said to Naomi, blessed be the Lord who has not left you this day without a redeemer, and may his name be renowned in Israel. He shall be to you a restorer of life and a nourisher of your old age. For your daughter-in-law who loves you, who is more to you than 7 sons, has given birth to him. And then Naomi took the child and laid him on her lap and became his nurse. And the women of the neighborhood gave him a name, saying, a son has been born to Naomi. And they named him Obed. He was the father of Jesse, the father of David. Now these are the generations of Perez. Perez fathered Hezron, Hezron fathered Ram, Ram fathered Amminadab, Amminadab fathered Nahshon, and Nahshon fathered Salmon. And Salmon fathered Boaz, Boaz fathered Obed, Obed fathered Jesse, and Jesse fathered David. Gentlemen, here when we come to determine the semantic structure of the passage, hopefully you would do what we just did about 20 times in the study at least. The best way I can describe how that reading, and rereading in the text works is just like a crock pot. For somehow, some way, when I first heard it, I thought, that's crazy. I've read the text once. Why do I need to read it again? I know what it says. But as you read, and reread, it just begins to marinate, it begins to soak, and all of a sudden the meat just falls off the bones, and that structure, those trees become crystal clear. You see how they relate to one another, and that packaging of how the author put that together becomes crystal clear. And you just read, and rework it until that comes out. And as you're doing that with narrative, as Dr. Charette so clearly explained, what you're doing is you're looking for the genre. What type of genre is this? Yes, it's narrative, but more specific than that. What about narration or the narrator and the point of view? And I've got these things notated in your notes. We're going to talk about them specifically. What about the plot, the setting, the characters, the dialogue, and the scene structure? So let's walk through some of these together when it comes to Ruth. The genre specifically is a quest story. I think perhaps is one of the best ways to put it. You'll find different commentators put this different ways. But a quest story that is a quest for rest. Chapter 1, verse 9 mentioned this, and also chapter 3, verse 1. A quest, a theme for rest and a home for Ruth specifically. So seeking and finding a home is the unifying action, and each of the 4 chapters is going to contribute a phase, if you will, to that quest. From chapter 1, tragic background, chapter 2, the courtship, chapter 3, the betrothal, and chapter 4, the marriage. Furthermore, concerning the genre, it is a short story with an apologetic focus. 4 basic characteristics of the way it functions here as an apologetic short story that you can see. Artistic literary style, that's pretty clear the way the Book of Ruth is written. The artistry there is phenomenal and unmistakable. The content deals with the lives of ordinary people and contains historic information. It's a historical story. Number 3, purpose is to entertain and instruct, right? So just think about it. When it comes to preaching, the purposes coming out of this genre are instructive for how and what you're going to do with your sermon. This wording in literature is there to entertain and to instruct. In fact, that reminds me of something Augustine said when preaching not only should teach, but it should paint. That is, it should give the imagery. It should give crystal clarity to what's going on visually almost through words, but also it should teach and it should paint, and also it should persuade. And when that persuasion comes in with the instruction part. And the 4th thing, the audience can appreciate the author's creativity in wedding the story's message and literary artistry. So Ruth is a short story that functioned historically, I think very clearly what we can say, as an example of God's providence, but also as an apology for David's reign as king, where he comes from, his lineage, and how he ascended to the throne. Moving on to the narration of the narrator and what's going on here. The author, narrator, is unknown and unnamed. However, it is key to understanding the book of Ruth is perceiving how the narrator implicitly presents the providence of God throughout the story. In fact, as Frederick Bush in his commentary writes, he says, at every level of the story, the author affirms the uniform Old Testament conviction that the world is fully and uniformly under the control of an all-powerful and all-knowing God. And Ruth is such a clear example of that. The plot. I think we could be more specific with the plot and call it a problem-based plot. This is structurally how it's operating. And this problem or conflict of some kind with a problem-based plot gives rise to a series of actions you're going to discover when you read this text that move toward a resolution, often including a heightening of the tension, which you have in Ruth chapter 4, we're going to talk about. And it creates that suspense that reaches a climax just before a conclusion or resolution. Some of these elements that you can see here in this type of plot, of a problem plot and other plots in general, from the setting, the problem, the complications, resolving incidents, resolution, the denouement there, which reveals the consequences of the resolution, and then the conclusion or the coda, which we're going to have at the very end of chapter 4. Now let's move to the setting. We've already covered the setting some, but when it comes to Ruth chapter 4, there are two specific parts of the setting, not just Bethlehem, but at the gate. That's going to become very critical here in a second, but also the house of Boaz. So it's helpful to know that. Where is this taking place as you're going to move through this text? The characters. I would argue that literarily speaking, the most important character as the story develops is not Ruth, but Naomi. Ruth and Boaz are full-fledged characters and important to the plot, and yet it is Naomi that the book opens with and her problem that ultimately comes to a resolution. It was her emptiness that comes to being filled. This is the problem of the story that comes in the afflicted life, the emptiness that she has. It's a son born to Ruth and Boaz mentioned in chapter 4, verse 13, but his significance is dedicated actually to Naomi there at the end of chapter 4. The characters, determining who they are, the major ones. The dialogue. One of the things that's key to recognize about chapter 4, and perhaps you picked up on it as we read, is that it is essentially dialogue that drives this story forward. Don't miss that. The characters are there, but it is the way the narrator sets up the dialogue of these characters that is going to create the critical moves or movement of this scene in this chapter. The scene structure, when we finally get down to actually determining how this structure folds out here in Ruth chapter 4, I want to give an overview of this before we dive into the specifics of it. Act 4, if you want to put each chapter in an overall act, here you have chapter 4 with Act 4, resolution and epilogue, verses 1 through 22, that works itself out in 3 scenes, I'll call them. The first one is verse 1 through 12, where Boaz acquires the right to redeem Naomi and Ruth. Scene 2, a son is born to Ruth and Boaz, and Naomi is restored to life and fullness. And then scene 3, the epilogue, a Judean family restored in the life of David that comes there. So what we see as you've perhaps in your study personally read and reread the text, and you're looking at the genre and the narrator, the characters, the plot, how it works, the dialogue and what's driving here, what you're going to come to find out is as this falls out with this final act in 3 scenes, 1 through 22, these 3 sections, 2 scenes are technical scenes, and then the final one I'm calling a scene is really the epilogue, the final conclusion of the story. Which, by the way, this structure parallels chapter 1 and provides balance and closure to the book as a whole. You'll notice that as you compare. Scene 1, verses 1 through 12, is when Boaz acquires the right to marry Ruth, and this resolves the question of a home and a husband for her and parallels chapter 1, verses 7 through 19a. And that chiastic structure that Dr. Allen shared earlier with you will be helpful to recognize these connections. Then you have scene 2, verses 13 through 17, where the women of the town joyously celebrate the son, and that parallels chapter 1, verses 19b through 22, and the reversal of the women of the town to whom Naomi poured out her bitter tale of grief and loss to. And then finally, the epilogue here is going to recount the family line of David, parallel to chapter 1, verses 1 through 6. For think about this, it documents 10 generations of birth, parallel to the account of 10 generations, or 10 years rather, of barrenness and death in Moab. Think of the reversal there. So I want to dive into the scene structure a little bit more in depth here, is to point out some things that you need to notice in preparation to preach Ruth chapter 4. Scene chapter 1, I want to come to first and walk through how it specifically falls out. This is verses 1 through 12, where Boaz acquires the right to redeem Naomi. So you're going to notice when you read this is framed by an inclusio that the author intentionally uses. The scene opens and closes at the gate with the elders. Notice the repetition of that in verses 1 and 2 at the gate, and then again in verses 11 and 12. That's code there for this is the opening and closing of a scene within this chapter. And then this scene is going to divide into 3 episodes, with episode 1 being verses 1 and 2, episode 2 being verses 3 through 8, and then episode 3, verses 9 through 12 here. And I want to talk about these episodes a little more specifically. Episode 1 is when Boaz assembling the three parties necessary for the negotiation and its ratification. So you have Boaz, you have the nearest redeemer, and you have the legal assembly necessary for that transaction to go on, that official decision to happen. And so their presence, as we read, is signaled by and he or they sat down. Did you notice that in the text? The author clearly lays out the parallel fashion of Boaz sat down, he's ready to do business. He gets the nearest redeemer, he just, behold, happens to come by. We'll talk about how that is presented in a second. He sits down, and then the elders sit down. Episode 2, you have two sections that are parallel. One is verses 3 through 4, and then you have verses 5 through 8 in episode 2. Each of these is a three-part dialogue which Boaz addresses the nearer redeemer, and he responds. And each section begins with the statement by Boaz. And there's some clear parallelism there. Finally, episode 3, verses 9 through 12, is Boaz's address to the assembly, and it's enclosed by an identical inclusio consisting of his summons to witness, between which is his formal affirmation of his acquisition of the rights to the property and the woman Ruth. Again, a chiastic structure going on there within this episode, and it concludes in verses 11 through 12 with the blessing of the legal assembly, and at the center of that is the blessing on Boaz that you'll see the structure highlighting. So that's scene 1. That's all verses 1 through 12, things that I would encourage you to notice as we work toward, before we work on our explanation of the text, we need to have all that in mind, that fodder there, in order to move through as the author has packaged it for us to notice. So moving to scene 2, a son is born to Ruth and Boaz, verses 13 through 17. The boundaries of this scene are marked by the inclusio, and she bore a son. This is in verse 13, part E, and then in verse 17b, a son has been born. An inclusio there that marks that out. 2 episodes within it. Episode verse 1 is verse 13 through 15, and then the second one, verses 16 and 17. These are separated because each of these episodes contains a narrative statement followed by a resulting action on the part of the women of the city. These scenes here are structurally parallel as they work out. The central point of the scene is to describe Naomi's restoration to life and fullness through the child. Scene 3, the epilogue. The family restored in the line of David, verses 18 through 22. What you have here is a genealogy, as we mentioned, of 10 generations from Perez to David, which balances the prologue, verses 1 through 6, that recounts the 10 years of death. So that's working through the specifics, scene 1, scene 2, scene 3, of things you're going to notice as you study and try to get a handle on the semantic structure of Ruth chapter 4. So just in summary, if we were to put this out, to lay it out before you, and I think some of this is on your handout for the structure. Scene 1, episodes 1, 2, and 3. And then we have scene 2, episodes 1 and 2. And then finally we have the epilogue with scene 3. So if you're going to create a sermon outline, before you get to how this is going to work out in your sermon, knowing how the author has laid it out here in the text is going to be critical to knowing exactly how you're going to represent that, mirror image that for the people as you walk it out and communicate it in a sermon. That's step number 1, determining the semantic structure. We've given the majority of our time to that because there's the most steps involved in that to get down to exactly how the author has packaged this. So as we work through this, let's move to step 2. What is the exegetical idea of the passage? What is an exegetical idea? It's a one sentence that restates the essence of the author's intent. And we're going to use this, by the way, once we form this, to translate that into the main idea of our sermon. And so here's my attempt at an exegetical idea of Ruth chapter 4. Here it is. God redeems Naomi and provides a home for Ruth through Boaz and his son Obed, who will be the grandfather of King David. God redeems Naomi and provides a home for Ruth through Boaz and his son Obed, who will be the grandfather of King David. So we've worked ourselves through the semantic structure all the way down to seeing exactly how the author has laid it out. Now we've come down to forming our exegetical idea. What is the author saying through the text? And that's it in one sentence, I believe. Now we move to steps 3 and 4. I'm combining these for our purposes of time today, translating the meaning of the text, taking what we've done exegetically and moving that into sermon form, and constructing the actual communication or sermon outline. So this is how we take the exegetical idea and represent it in a sermon, and we're going to do that by doing exactly what I just mentioned, turning this into a main idea into sermon points, or for a narrative genre and sermon moves, if you will. And Dr. Charette did a good job of actually stating how these can be transitional statements rather than propositional points as you transition and work through telling the story of Ruth chapter 4. But I want to give you what I've got it on your handout here, my attempt at moving to a sermon outline. The introduction, some ideas for this. One thing I would probably do is do a recap of chapter 1 through 3. If you're preaching Ruth 4, people are going to need to have that set up for them by some of the information in the first 3 chapters. You can set up chapter 4 by resurfacing the tension present at the end of chapter 3. In fact, I would strongly encourage you to do that. Chapter 4 doesn't make much sense without that question mark that you're left hanging with in the book of Ruth after chapter 3. What is Boaz going to do about it? Is he going to man up and take care of business and pursue this woman or not? Perhaps that all could be ideas for the introduction as we work through this potential sermon outline. So, sermon move 1. Notice I'm talking in terms of moves instead of points here. And what we're going to do is start off with episode 1. We're going to start right where the story starts us and dive right into the details, working through verses 1 and 2 as Boaz convenes the legal assembly, moving to episode 2, where he negotiates with the near Redeemer, and then to episode 3, where the legal assembly ratifies that agreement and blesses Boaz. So just think about it. You've had your introduction, you've set the chapter up, you've dove right off into the story, and then you come down with a transitional statement that's going to give everyone what we've seen so far in scene 1, and I think you could summarize it by saying it like this. Scene 1, the first thing we see is that Boaz strategically secures the right to redeem Ruth. And that sums up so far the first 12 verses. Boaz strategically secures the right to redeem Ruth. But then you'll transition to move 2 and pick back up with the story. Episode 1 of sermon move 2 here, verses 13 through 15. Boaz marries Ruth, and a son is born to restore Naomi. And this son, Obed, is the grandfather of David. And this is going to bring you to the point of scene 2, or the transitional statement, if you will, that God supernaturally supplies a son to redeem and restore Naomi. So notice we haven't given any propositional points yet. Now, is there application to be made along the way? Certainly. In fact, I looked at one sermon that one preacher had done on chapter 4, and he just stopped and started making some application on how Boaz, being a worthy man, did what was right at the beginning and the way he pursued this woman. He could have gone about it a lot of different ways, and there's some application there to be done. And yet I'm waiting to inload the application at the end once I give them the point of Ruth 4, because we haven't gotten to the point of Ruth chapter 4 yet. I'm working them, bringing them with me on the journey there, and I'm giving them some transitional statements to make sure they're following me there as I tell the story. So that brings us through sermon move 2, moving to sermon move 3, all representing the structure that we found that the author has given us. 10 years of death, 10 generations of birth. But the story is not over. David to Jesus and the connection with the New Testament and the genealogy that is there in Ruth, that is furthered and completed there in Matthew and actually in Luke as well. But Matthew 1 through 16, showing us how this son born would lead to another. Scene 3, God sovereignly saves his people, is the way I've put it there. God sovereignly saves his people. So all this culminates is going to come down to you giving the main point of what this story is. It's been presented by the author as he's composed it. Now, what is the point? What is it all saying? What does it mean? We've seen exactly how the scenes unfold, but what exactly does this all come down to? And this main idea is here how I've put. In fact, I've tweaked it a little bit from the handouts you have, because Sermon main ideas are something we're always seeking to craft for more clarity and make them sticky, make them stick where they're unforgettable. They just rivet into people's minds. That's what you're working to craft clarity and use words that are exact here. And the way I've worded it is that God directs the details of our ordinary lives in order to accomplish His extraordinary design. Number of ways that you could say what I just said. That was just my best attempt at it. And like I said, I've even tweaked it between the time I put it on the handout and today. So you're always working to craft that for clarity. But that's the way I would take that exegetical idea that you saw that mentioned Ruth, mentioned Naomi, mentioned Obed, and yet for my congregation, I'm interim pastor. For your congregation, when you go to tell them, for them to work out in their own lives, what is that truth you're wanting to drive home from this text? You translate that into words that they can immediately understand and apply. That's the main idea. At this point, you would launch directly into the application and exhortation. And by the way, don't miss that exhortation. I put that on there because, you see, you can tell people what they should do, but I believe it's our job as preachers for us to plead with them to do it, to persuade them, to seek to conquer their will to actually implement and do this, to tell them what they should do as a result of God's truth, but then plead with them to do it. So that's what I mean will go on there in the sermon, and that will lead to the sermon conclusion. So that's an example of moving from that exegetical structure, semantic structure, to a sermon outline. Now, I want to give you a couple other ideas, though, just to perhaps stimulate your thinking. A couple other main ideas from other preachers. These are not my own, but this is how some other guys put it. One, when God writes the last chapter of your love story, it always ends well. That's how one preacher put it. Second one put it like this: the life of the godly is not a straight line to glory, but they do get there. You can see how he's pulling that even from the exegetical idea that we had. Now let me give you this. This is an example outline from another preacher here. Look at this right here. This is fine alliteration right here, by the way. The bridegroom, which is Boaz. Notice he's got verses 1 through 10 by this. The bride, Ruth, verses 11 and 12. The baby, Obed, verses 13 through 17a. And then the bigger story, a king. And that sounds actually phenomenal. But do you notice any differences with that compared to what we did based on the structure of the way we saw the author clearly and all the evidence with the inclusios, with the repetition, with what he wanted to emphasize? Do you see how this outline actually doesn't follow that? A couple things. I would say the alliteration is well done. That's certainly a masterpiece of that. And yet, my critique of it would be that each point communicates a name but not a complete idea. And be careful about that. Be careful about giving your people points that don't give them a full idea to comprehend. At that point, you could give them a lot more than a name, and you will, obviously, in the sermon, but that point is what's going to stand out in their minds. And this outline, by the way, this is the difference between text-driven preaching and text-centered preaching. This outline is character-driven, but remember in the text how we talked about it, the text is dialogue-driven. And so the dialogue actually helps set up the way that he wants to structure it, the way we have it. But this goes back and uses something a little bit different than the author's not really using to drive the structure, and it's the characters. And so in a way it falls short of representing the structure of the text, if you will. And so being a little more text-centered, very biblical, and yet not as perhaps text-driven as it could be. So that's just another example. Now we move to part 2. We've done the interpreting of the text. Text-driven preaching is interpreting and communicating a biblical text, and we're moving to part 2 of our 10 steps. Step 5 is developing the logic of the transitions. This is a little different for an inductive sermon that moves in a narrative way rather than a logical flow of ideas or argument from a deductive text. So the logic of the transitions is going to be what maintains the rising tension. What is it that hooks one scene to the next? One move the author makes to the next, from one scene to another. Some things you can ask to find out and what to use on this is, will Ruth find rest and a home? That's unresolved until we get to chapter 4. What's Boaz going to do about it in verse 1? And oh no, the nearest Redeemer says he will redeem. A punch in the gut all of a sudden. We think now Boaz has got no shot. Surely this other guy's going to take the land and And Boaz is going to be out from being able to pursue Ruth as his wife, hitting the pause button to explain the sandal custom. Narrator's doing something with that. Ruth was barren. How can the name of the dead be perpetuated if she's barren? How will this son redeem, and will his name be renowned in Israel based on the blessing in verses 14 and 17? All these things are rising, putting forth a tension that is rising in the text that can help you link from one move to the next as the author works through. Step 6, express the flow of the explanation. All right, so now we're coming to the point where you've not only done your exegetical work, the semantic structure, you have translated that to an outline. Now we need to put meat on the bones. We've got the skeleton. Now we got to flesh this thing out. So this is what we might call the functional elements of preaching, which are explanation, illustration, application, and argumentation. And this is what we dive into here with explanation. What I want to do is just point out in each scene as we go some things that I think are critical to be explained and that I think are key for us to understand in preparing a sermon from Ruth 4 on some things you'll need to pay attention to. Number one, in scene 1 is the city gates. Most people are not going to have an understanding of what this was, what these were in terms of how they were used, but they're complex structures as part of the wall or the tower of the city that had a series of rooms on either side of the gateway where defenders could be positioned, but in this case, they also served as a gathering place for the citizens of the town. This is where official administration and judicial business of the community was conducted. So you could think modern-day city hall or a courthouse where transactions were officially made. Next is in scene 1, the word behold there in verse 1. Now, simple one-word things like this may not seem like much, but the author is trying again to get our attention here to say, and as Boaz sat down, it seems like as you just read it on the surface that the kinsman redeemer, the nearest one, just happened to come by, but we know that's no coincidence. In fact, looking back to chapter 2, verse 4, it's the same word there, behold, when Boaz shows up in the field and sees and notices Ruth. So now again, the narrator's doing the same thing to draw your attention back. Hey, something big is happening here. God's at work. It wasn't just a random field she showed up in. It was Boaz. Imagine if Ruth would have shown up in the wrong field, but it just happened to be Boaz's field. This is God's providence behind every move that as the author is drawing our attention to. Don't be fooled. This is no accident. Then he calls this nearest redeemer friend, or perhaps what could be more accurately rendered in English, Mr. So-and-so. In fact, in the Hebrew, it's actually an idiom that works with the combination of a couple rhyming but meaningless words on their own. So think about in English, we do this with hodgepodge, or we do this with heebie-jeebies, or hocus pocus, things that we put together and use in context, and we know what that means, but separately and out of context, they would have no meaning. That's what the author does here with referring to this, translated in my version, friend, but perhaps would be better rendered Mr. So-and-so or hey you in the purposes of what he's trying to do here. And his namelessness, you think about this, he's leaving this man nameless for a purpose. And that purpose is to cast a less than favorable impression on this character. The irony is, by seeking to protect his future legacy, Mr. So-and-so ended up having his name, himself nameless, missing out on a share in the biggest legacy of all, a place in God's plan of salvation. So even small things like that, the author is doing for a reason. Don't miss them for how he uses the language and terminology there. So next is something that the men before me have already pointed out, but the idea of a kinsman redeemer and property redemption and levirate marriage in verses 3 through 6, the kinsman redeemer being the nearest adult male relative who had the right and responsibility of redeeming or buying back property, bringing out the destitute out of slavery. More on this in the application, but you'll need to explain that concept. Property redemption out of Leviticus 25. You'll need to explain a process by which a relative could assure that land would not leave the family. Land was everything. Land was their sustenance. If land left the family and had no way of getting it back, they would have no way of actual provision in the future. So God had a way of protecting the property that he had allotted out to his chosen people there in Israel. And levirate marriage. Deuteronomy 25, the background of that's going to need to be explained. The process God implemented so that a childless widow could be cared for and descendants raised up for the deceased. In other words, the dead husband's brother would marry the widow to provide an heir. And all that is connected and brought together in Ruth 4. Things to be explained. Also, something to be explained is what does it mean by selling the land in verse 3? You'll read commentators on this. There's actually a couple of different options. I prefer the first option. I'll give you just a couple that are here, but I think the first option is the most viable. And it's that the land is Naomi's due to the death of her husband and sons, but there is a problem. She can't work it. She's an elderly widow. She needs someone. She needs to sell it to a kinsman or redeemer who can work the land and provide for her and keep the land in the family. But some others might see it a little bit different, and I think this is a potential possibility. I don't think there's as much warrant for it, but this could mean someone else now owns the land. Perhaps Elimelech sold it when he moved to Moab. And so Naomi is selling her right of redemption to the property because she cannot redeem it, and she can't work it. So what does that mean? She's selling the land. That's something that you'll need to explain for what's going on there. Now, why does the closest redeemer first say yes, but then no? This is a critical turn in the narrative here. So at first, it's a deal that he cannot pass up. He says in just 2 words, I'll redeem. I'll redeem. It's a brief, and think about this, it's a brief and it's a self-serving utterance that he gives there. In just 2 words. Hey, that sounds great for me. Sounds like it's got rewards and benefits. I'll redeem it. That's a financial deal I don't want to pass up. Without a descendant in the line of Elimelech, the amount he must spend to redeem the field is more than offset by the value of the produce of the field. And with no heir, the field will remain his even at the year of Jubilee. This is a no-brainer right here. Yes, I'll redeem. But Boaz pulls out his ace. He pulls a trump card here and says, well, wait a second. There's more responsibility that goes with it. Boaz calls on the nearest redeemer to take on the responsibility of producing an heir by marrying Ruth, who belongs to Naomi and is connected with the land. And this would mean the land would pass to the heir produced from his marriage to Ruth. That is the nearest redeemer's marriage if he were to marry Ruth, and he would therefore not regain what he spent on the land and lose out on his descendants, direct descendants he already has, gaining his full estate, because part of it would be spent on gaining this property. And so he says he doesn't want to do that. He's not interested anymore. There's also something mentioned that's a little bit strange, this former custom of exchanging sandals. This was a custom that symbolized the abandonment of the obligation resting on the closest redeemer, on the closest kinsman to redeem. And the idea here is that fixed property was claimed by treading or putting one's foot on the soil. So the picture is of man taking his foot off this soil and saying, I am no longer claiming any right of ownership to this land, taking my feet off of it. Exchange of sandals symbolized that. Now, the blessings here in verses 11 and 12, the final thing that we'll mention on scene 1 of things to explain. The blessings here bring up Rachel and Leah, the wives of Jacob. And of course, you've got Zilpah and Bilhah involved in that episode there, but they bore the patriarchs of Israel. Leah was the mother of Judah, and then it mentions the house of Perez there. May your house be built up like the house of Perez, being the most prominent clan in Judah. There was a prominence there that the blessing connected to wanted them to experience and ask for God to give that same prominence as the clan of Perez in Judah. So those are some things in scene 1 that you're going to need to dive into and somehow bring some clarity as you preach and tell the story. But moving to scene 2, some things to explain. This scene 2, by the way, is in the story itself. So we're not talking about the epilogue yet, but in just the story itself, if you limit it just to the story of Ruth, this story, this scene in the story is the high point in the culmination of the 4th act. It's the whole book of Ruth. It resolves the death and emptiness that have afflicted the life of Naomi. Scene 2. Ruth became his wife, verse 13. Why was Ruth given rest and a home? Well, she went from being a foreigner to a slave to a servant to now the wife of Boaz. You better believe that she received rest and a home. In fact, the narrator, the way he gives that to you in the beginning of verse 13 is 5 short, almost rapid-fire clauses. Perhaps you picked up on the way we read them. So Boaz took Ruth. She became his wife. He went into her, and the Lord gave her conception, and she bore a son. Just like that, in very few concise words, we cover at least 9 months in time. Just like that, all of a sudden. And this sets the narrator's approval on Boaz and what he has done. And those clauses are there. Now, the women in response, they say in verses 14 and 15. Think back now on this, what the women have already said to Naomi when she came back from Moab. You don't look so good, Naomi. Is this Naomi? They can barely recognize her. And yet now what they say when they refer to Naomi here about being restored and filled. Their words here, the narrator's way of giving us the final evaluation on the character of God in Ruth. Ruth being more than 7 sons. Ruth was there all along, even when Naomi thought she had nothing and God had completely abandoned her. There Ruth was, who would come along, God would use. Better than 7 sons, this expression is the ideal number of sons in the biblical perspective, being one who is fully blessed and full. Moving from what the women say to Obed. Here in verse 17, the meaning of his name is significant. Has the meaning of provider or guardian, one who will care for and sustain Naomi in her old age. He is Naomi's redeemer. Her emptiness is turned to fullness, and he's the grandfather of David. This brevity here, the terseness of this scene in verses 13 through 17, it's almost as if the narrator comes along, presents these events with the sense of, oh, and what did you expect would happen? Let me just lay it on you. What did you expect? I'm about to just put it out there and on you. Before you know it, it's like we've been in this wondering, what is Boaz going to do? And then, oh, what the nearest redeemer. And then all of a sudden, your guts have been tied in knots waiting for what's going to happen. And then boom, boom, 5 bullets right to the chest. It's like, whoa. And then he just lays it out how God, behind the scenes, answered every single of the questions and every single thing that we wondered, how in the world could this be resolved? That's the way the text presents that. What did you expect? God comes through. Then moving to scene 3, some things quickly that I want you to notice. The linear genealogy, type of genealogy used typically to legitimize or establish the claims of the last person named to fulfill an official function, thereby going back to the legitimacy of David's reign. And then you have the symbolism of 10 going on here that's significant. 10 names in Ruth's new family more than fill her 10 years of childlessness. Death and emptiness are transformed into life and fullness. And by the way, in a genealogy, that word for fathered can mean fathered or ancestor here. And so the idea here is that purpose of 10 is not so much to give or include every single name necessarily, but the idea there of giving for the purpose of meaning and the symbolism represented there in the text. Now we move to the purpose of the coda, or this epilogue, if you will, at the very end, verses 18 through 22, from David to Jesus. So the purpose of a coda takes the audience out of the time frame of the story, and it brings them back to real time. It pulls back, it zooms out, if you will. And when you apply that purpose, which is working here to bring them back to the time of all the way up to David, when you apply that purpose to the biblical canon, the genealogy, Matthew 1, verses 1 through 16, the genealogy in Luke 3 come into play, and how this genealogy has led to so much more than one can even expect, perhaps, or anticipate when reading the Book of Ruth initially. God worked through Boaz here to redeem not just Ruth and Naomi, but to bring about the great Redeemer, Jesus Christ. And applied here, the Messiah, the Lion, the tribe of Judah, is the root of Jesse and is the root of the descendant of David. Did the blessings pronounced on Boaz and Obed come true? Yes, and so much more so than we ever expected. God's providence and blessing goes beyond this one family to the nation and ultimately to all of mankind. Truly, God's providence is at every turn in this story. Those are some things that I would highlight for explanation in those three scenes. That moves us to step 7, though, and illustrations. Now, I'm not going to spend much time on this because when preaching narrative, you've got so much illustrative material there in the story itself. And yes, you can use illustrations and insert things to perhaps help modernize and give people things to see in their time and their day. But one of the things I do want to bring up that I think would be helpful is actually to illustrate what's going on in the text with this epilogue, with this coda, this ending that is a genealogy that at first read, one would think, why is that added there as an additional, material or credits? Well, I think what you could parallel this to for your people to understand what the author's doing is when you go to a movie and you watch that movie and the movie ends, you've been there, right? And the credits start rolling. But somebody told you that this movie has a hidden scene. Somebody's seen this movie before you, thankfully, otherwise you'd have gotten up and walked out. But this movie's got a hidden scene. They've told you about it, so you sit there and wait. You know something's coming. And sure enough, that's exactly what's going on here in the book of Ruth. In this coda here, there's not a hidden scene. It's very there and clear for us to see, but there's something more. This is bigger than we ever thought about in the book. This is bigger than Naomi. This is bigger than Ruth. This is bigger than Boaz. This is something far bigger no one could expect or see coming, that nowhere could even be put on the credits to realize how big a story this little story is pointing to. So you might use something like that to illustrate what's going on, how a hidden scene can be at the end of a movie there. Moving from illustrations to application and argumentation. I'm going to major on the application here. There's times when you might want to add more or less argumentation. If you believe that people might have a hard time accepting what you're saying, just actually finished preaching through the book of Jonah. And, there's things in Jonah that there's going to be people in your audience that are going to be naturally skeptical about. So I spent some time doing some argumentation there. You don't have so much of that here in Ruth, but if you come to points where you feel that's necessary, that's the time to do that. But here at the end, we've walked through, we've told the story. We've transitioned with statements that summarize exactly what's going on. We've explained, we've done some inserted illustrations, and now we come to the point where we're going to make this real and put it in specific applications. So let me give you some. I've given you some there on your handout that I think are very clear applications of this. Number one, God is king. Trust him. He is sovereignly ruling over every detail of life. That jumps off the pages of the book of Ruth. God is kind, and he knows our needs. Rest in his provision. In fact, God's supreme kindness is seen as he meets our deepest needs. You see the need for food met, the need for family met, the need for a Savior even met through this story. God's kindness is personified through the Hesed actions of Ruth and Boaz. In fact, you see exemplary actions of Deuteronomy 6:5, loving God with all your heart, mind, and soul, and then Leviticus 19:18, loving your neighbor as yourself, exemplified through these two characters. And of course, that kindness can be explained in the New Testament terms of the fruit of the Spirit. And I love what an author named Barry Webb said. He says, to put on kindness is to clothe ourselves with the very character of God himself. And man, you can make that real for your people as they've seen that exemplified through Ruth and Boaz and the kindness of God, as they've exemplified that and as that's been poured out on them, and as now Christ in us, the Holy Spirit working out the character of God in us and our kindness as we reflect the character of God. God is merciful. Rejoice in him. Despite our sin and setbacks, God's sovereignly working for the good of his people. Right? Romans 8:28 has been referenced already. Think about this. In his mercy, God accepts the unacceptable from the book of Ruth. He accepts and rewards a Moabite foreigner who turned to him. No Moabite was supposed to enter the assembly of Yahweh to the 10th generation. Notice again the symbolism there of 10. The author's using that purposefully. The law of Moses taught explicitly that the king of Israel must be from among your own brothers. And yet he includes a Moabite in his line, one who turned to Yahweh. Repent and run to him. God is merciful. The application, you think your family's messed up? Not this messed up. A Canaanite widow, and it mentions Tamar in verse 12 of this chapter, a Canaanite widow who pretended to be a prostitute, solicited herself to her father-in-law when he had excluded her from levirate marriage, producing Perez, becoming the most prominent clan in Judah. That chronicled in Genesis 38. God is merciful. Rejoice in him. God is faithful and he rewards faithfulness, so obey him. Naomi returns to the promised land and Ruth clings to Naomi. She converts. That's very obvious there that she says, your God's going to be my God, not the Moabite God and the God of the land that she had been a part of. She turns to Yahweh. Boaz is a worthy man. Ruth is a worthy woman. They go about it the right way in chapter 3. And Boaz pursues her the right way at the beginning of chapter 4. Their obedience and faithfulness is rewarded. God brings his people, think about this, these themes in the book of Ruth that come to conclusion in chapter 4, from death to life, from curse to blessing, from bitterness to happiness, from emptiness to fullness, and from despair to hope. One way to put it, as one preacher said, even in our pain, God is plotting for our good. Ruth was by Naomi's side the whole time, even when she was bitter. Cling to him, obey him. God is faithful. God answers prayer and gives life. Ask him to provide and bless. So we see here in chapter 4, the elders and the people, they pronounce a blessing over Ruth and Boaz that calls on God to act on their behalf. And God hears and God answers. God is weaving your story into his story. Find your purpose and identity in him. The same God at work in the life of Ruth and Boaz and Naomi is at work in your life. God is using ordinary people to accomplish his extraordinary purposes. Finally, one more application. God is fulfilling his promise to bring salvation to the nations. Join him and worship him. Boaz brought Naomi and her family rest. So David brought Israel rest. So Christ gives his bride rest. So Christ is our kinsman redeemer. What Boaz foreshadowed, Christ would completely do in a way for you and for me that we could have never imagined. As an extension of the promise of Genesis chapter 12, verse 3, to be a blessing through Abraham's offspring, that Ruth carries on and chronicles for us how God would do that in his providence all the way forward to where David then connects with Christ from the New Testament genealogy in Matthew 1. Christ is our kinsman redeemer. Think about this. Christ was qualified to redeem as Boaz was, by becoming like us, taking on human flesh, being close kin to us, becoming one of us, fully man and fully God. He was capable. He had the resources. Boaz was a worthy man, capable financially of redeeming. Christ was capable of redeeming us by his perfect righteousness and sinlessness, and he was willing to redeem because of his love for us. If you want to alliterate that, this is not original with me, but this will preach right here. Christ had the right to redeem, he had the resources to redeem, and he had the resolve to redeem. And he did just that. Matthew 28 then connects Genesis 12:3 and Ruth to the commission now that we've been called to join God in his mission to the nations to make disciples. Join him, worship him, and make disciples. Finally, step 10, and I'm out of time here. Craft the conclusion and the introduction. Let me just give you two ideas really quick here for the ways you might craft an introduction and conclusion here. Again, this is where you use your own creativity to figure out how you're going to launch and conclude. But option number one might be is that you introduce Boaz in scene 1 as a man on a mission. This man is pursuing this woman, and he is relentlessly doing so the right way. He's a man on a mission. And then you could close in chapter 4 with the realization that ultimately God's the one on a mission here. God is the one on a mission to pursue his bride, not just Ruth after the woman named Ruth, but God after his people, the church. This love story points to the bigger love story of the Bible. This love and marriage that would produce Obed will one day extend God's love and mercy to the whole world. And that covenant with David in 2 Samuel 7 and the promises of Isaiah 9 and 11 that state that this kingdom will reach around the world. So that might be one way of introducing and concluding. A second idea might be to reach back to the questions planted by the narrator in chapter 1 for the introduction and answer these questions in the conclusion. You say, what do I mean by that? Well, the name Elimelech means God is king. But when you look at what's happening in the life of Elimelech, the implicit question planted by the author is Yahweh king? Is he in control? Is God really in control? And Naomi means pleasant or delightful. Her name sounds like sweet, and yet she even tells the people, the women, to call her bitter, call her Mara, because of what she accuses God of doing, of the way she's come back. So the implicit question there is God good? So chapter 1 sets up these questions: is God in control, and is he good? And those questions are answered in chapter 4. The tragedy turns, her bitterness turns to fullness, and her emptiness turns to fullness. The last thing I want to show you here, quote from Paul House, and then I'm done. I think this is helpful here as he summarizes what Ruth accomplishes. He says, Ruth confirms Job's belief that God vindicates and Proverbs' contention that the Lord blesses the righteous. The text demonstrates how laws found in Leviticus and Deuteronomy ought to be obeyed, and illustrates once again how the women blessed with children in Genesis, Judges, and Samuel are not beneficiaries of a happy coincidence, but are recipients of divine pleasure. Covenants made with Abraham, Moses, and David are honored here in this book. And watch this. It's hard to imagine a book so short doing more to maintain the faith of the whole canon of the Bible. All in the book of Ruth. Ruth 4, God's providence. They're put on display. That God's using He's using ordinary people to accomplish his extraordinary design. Thank you.